Okay, we're live. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. With me again are my dear friends Sahib Saeed and Saqib Hussain. And today, inshallah, by the way, salams, you guys. So today, our hope is to cover the equivalent passage in the Old Testament, or the Book of Genesis, compared to ayah number 36 to 42 of Surah Yusuf, which is the episode of his exchange with the prisoners, him entering the prison, up until the point that the dreams have been interpreted and they're being released. Saqib, you told me that the corresponding portion of Genesis is 39:20 onwards, all the way through all of 40, right?
So that's right, yeah.
Okay, so let's get right into it. We'll try to follow a certain pattern, a structure in this conversation. So I'm going to read a little bit. You'll put a stop to me where you want to add commentary. And then we'll think about what the equivalent Qur'an passage is compared to what we're reading in the Bible, or if there isn't one. And we'll think about what that could signify. Okay, so let's start. So here I am reading 39:20. And he became incensed, and Joseph's master took him and placed him in the prison house, the place where the king's prisoners were held. Where did I just go? Okay, and he was there in the prison house, and God was with Joseph, and extended kindness to him, and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison house warden. And the prison house warden placed in Joseph's hands all the prisoners who were in the prison house, and all that they were to do there. It was he who did it. The prison house warden had to see nothing that was in his hands, as the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made succeed.
Yeah, so that was, if you think back to the beginning of the chapter, which is when Joseph is sold to the house of Potiphar. So there's a clear inclusio, like the language is a repeated at the start and end. Yeah. So it adds like this kind of same as you see in the Quran as well, this kind of bracketing effect, a start and an end. But also there's as well as there being an inclusio, you get this parallelism that Joseph is kind of thrown into a situation of relative comfort, and God is with him because he's in the house. He's not a field slave, for example. He's in charge of all the other servants. But now he's in a situation of comparative difficulties in prison, but God is still with him, and he's still showing him kindness. So it's showing him that in these two extremes of his situation, still a slave, but still living in a pretty luxurious circumstance, God's with him, and now he's a prisoner, and still God is with him. And still God is kind of showing to the Egyptians who surround him just what a blessed person he is. And then I think I mentioned on a previous kind of conversation that there is one difference in that here, whereas when he was in Potiphar's house, what's interesting is that he was given charge over everything except the food that entered Potiphar's belly, right? Potiphar, it kind of made a point to say he kept hold of kind of his own very personal matters, and the way it phrased that was the food that he would eat. And here, even that has been handed over to Joseph. So you see, even though it seems as if his power is declining, the language actually suggests his power is increasing, which is really interesting. And you see that motif kind of being built on in the next chapter.
Sahib, I was thinking, if we were to compare this to the Quran's depiction, first of all, the food thing, let's start with the last thing you mentioned. If the Bible makes mention of him having the keys to the house except for food when it comes to the minister, and here he has kind of a hand over all things. And it's interesting that in the Quran, Allah actually mentions him talking about the food coming and him interpreting the dream before the food gets here. So there's an inclusion here that's kind of on the contrary.
Yeah. Although it is kind of contrary in the sense that it sounds like he is not supposed to know about the food, and then he's able to tell them something based on a higher technical knowledge rather than someone who's dealing with the food.
Yeah. The other kind of contrasting view seems to be, if we accept this biblical account and see it as a complement to the Quran's version, I'm not sure if we can, but if we do that, then he is pretty much got the reins to deal with the prisoners as a substitute for the warden. And they clearly see him as a much better alternative than the warden. And that would maybe explain Inna naraka min al-muhsinin, because their circumstance in prison is drastically improved because the person who manages them or takes care of them or the day-to-day issues is actually Yusuf alayhi salam. So that might be an explanation of possibly. That's at least what crossed my mind.
I mean, yeah, so seeing him as among the muhsinin, the word muhsin, has a few different possibilities you can take from it. It could be like morally, and he treats people well. That's one aspect, and that could be relevant. But also, it can be someone who just does their job well, who is good at something. So it could be good at dream interpretation, but it can just be that see you as someone who has done well. It has to be based on something. So that's why the Mufassirin generally will fill in with this kind of detail that perhaps he had helped other people with their dreams or had helped other people with their problems.
Right.
And at the same time, they seemed, from the way that the ayah is worded, they seemed to be coming into the prison at the same time as him.
Right.
So one would understand that this must have been a little bit later for them to have formed a judgment about him.
Right. The other thing that I was thinking was go ahead, Saqib.
So I was just going to say that understanding of Muhsinin would sort of fit with what we've seen elsewhere, both in the surah and in Genesis, of language which is used kind of religiously or theologically elsewhere in the Quran, being used in a much more kind of neutral linguistic, lexical sense here.
I was also thinking, actually, on the spiritual side, the exact opposite of that. The Bible's language, the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, أَن تَعْبُدَ اللَّهَ كَأَنَّكَ تَرَاهُ, as the prophetic description of ihsan, that you worship Allah as if you can see him, in a constant presence of Allah with you.
Yeah.
And Inna naraka min al-muhsinin is almost like a substitute for the Lord was with him and the Lord made him succeed. And even the Lord made him succeed, كَذَلِكَ نَجْزِي الْمُحْسِنِينَ is kind of a theme already established in the surah previously. So the muhsinin are rewarded, That was an interesting parallel that I thought was there. Shall I read on?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a footnote here by the book. Should I read this footnote?
This chapter, go ahead.
I'll just read it. Okay. This chapter is most elegantly symmetrical episode in Genesis. It comprises an introductory narrative frame verse 1 to 6, a cloning frame 20 to 23, which is what you're talking about right now.
Right.
Yeah. That elaborately echoes the introductory verses and central story of the failed seduction, which is intricately linked to the framing verses by a network of recurring thematic keywords. Okay, got it. That's fine. Okay. Then you've got number 1. Does that mean we're on
Genesis
40. These are further comments.
Oh yeah, you can skip this kind of end notes and we can move to Genesis 40.
Yeah, let's go to 40. So now this is Genesis 40. And it happened after these things, and the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker gave offense to their lord, the king of Egypt, and Pharaoh was furious with his 2 courtiers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker.
Okay, so maybe we can stop there.
Yeah, let's do that.
So you see again the food and drink motif reappearing, right?
Right.
So it's really interesting that there's this innocent little comment at the beginning of Genesis 39 that Potiphar kept in charge of his own food and drink, and you think, okay, his personal affairs. And now you're seeing Joseph apparently declining in power, but really the hint there that he's being given everything that he didn't even previously have. And you also see a foreshadow of what's happening, because just as the food, the guy who makes the food and the guy who pours the drink are now going to be put under the charge of Joseph, or what's going to happen as we go forward, right? The nourishment of Egypt is going to be put under charge of Joseph. So it's a really nice little technique.
Right. Okay. So of course the Quran does not mention the roles of these 2 people except describing them as fatayan, which is interesting
except later, yasqi rabbakum khamra.
So by implication, in terms of what they dreamt about, and then what happens, at least to one of them, what's explained he's going to do. Right? He's going to pour for his master. So by implication, yeah, but it doesn't describe them at the beginning as this is the chief baker or chief cupbearer. They just tell that they are seeing in their dreams. So at this point of the story, with the way that it's told in the Qur'an, you don't know whether he's seeing something that he's already accustomed to doing, or whether he's seeing something very strange. Actually, one would assume he's seeing something very strange. Otherwise, why would he go? This is the question that comes to my mind, is why would they come and ask about, I saw a dream of me doing my job. Why would that be so surprising to them, right? So that's a question that we maybe reach some kind of answer to, but still intrigues me, to be honest.
The only counter thought to that I had, Sohaib, was that he is in prison now, and he doesn't get to do that anymore, and he keeps seeing a dream as if life is normal again, or something like that. And he finds that strange, that's behind me now. There's no way I'll ever get back to that, so why do I keep seeing that dream? Maybe.
Yeah.
The thing that stuck out to me, though, is the Quran describes them as fatayan, 2 young men. And to have chief positions, you would imagine that the cupbearer and the baker should be the experienced, seasoned old chefs, or cupbearers.
Really
but the Quran does take the note that they are fatayan. And then the other contrast is the biblical account is very explicit in describing him as their Lord, Rabbahu, or Rabbahuma, but the king of Egypt. And the Quran did not explicitly open it up that way or elaborate that it's in fact the king of Egypt. It's just Rabbahu Khamra, and udhkurni inda rabbik. And if you only knew the story up in this point and you didn't have the hindsight of knowing the entire thing, you wouldn't know that that's referring to the king.
Yes, and right? It's very clearly Lord, Adonai him.
Sohaib, we lost your audio, I think.
Oh, I don't know.
Oh. Okay, we got you. Okay. We're good. So those are the things that popped in my head. Anyway, go ahead.
So I was going to add that the cupbearer or the wine pourer. So this is mashtay sarha mashtim. So from the same root as saqa yasqi in right we have in Arabic, and it's the function of the cupbearer in kind of ancient Egyptian society seems to have been similar to what sort of developed in Persian culture with the saqi. Right, so he's not just there to pour the drink. He's like the confidant of the king. He's kind of the guy who stays up at night with him and tells him cultured stories. So it's interesting that it's the
ancient bartender.
Right, it's the ancient bartender. Right, exactly. And so the fact that Joseph is kind of in with the cupbearer, it means he's going to get the ear of the king, if he remembers what to do.
Yeah, because he is in a personal assistant kind of position in a more intimate and informal setting than other employees or other people in the
exactly.
in the service of the king. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so I'm going to keep reading then, unless maybe you have anything to add. Should I keep reading?
No, it was just to slightly improve on what I said.
Your face told me there's something to add. Your face told me. I knew. I had a feeling.
I'm sure I hummed or I harumphed, I think. So it was the point that I said that he's seeing what he always does. I mean, that's not quite accurate, because when I thought about it more, it actually says, I see myself pressing wine, or which they understand pressing grapes, right? So there is something odd about it. Except, again, maybe it's also the case that Yusuf a.s. didn't necessarily know that who this person was. So was he the cupbearer and so on? So they gave him some vague details, and then he figured out who they are and their role, and then he sees where they're going to go with this. The other person seeing bread, and the thing is that the dream as described in the Bible is clearly more detailed, and then those same details find their way into our tafsir. So Tafsir al-Razi, for example, recounts the dream just as it is in Genesis. So then it's seen that as if the Quranic expression is just a shorthand for all of that, which is detailed in the Bible. But that's an open question. Is it referring to the same dream just in a few words, or is it a slightly different take on what the dream was?
That's interesting.
Can I ask a question? Shaksa, just a tafsir question, if I may. So when Razi gives these extra details, does he give any indication that he's taking this directly from the biblical account, or could he be taking it from earlier tafsir which have the same level of details?
I'll try to see what he says, but Al-Razi doesn't take directly from the Bible, as far as I'm aware.
Okay.
These kind of things, he would just say it is narrated it is said. And then sometimes they will name the early authorities who said it, usually Wahab ibn Munabbih or others like that.
Okay.
Very good. And he put them under guard in the house of the high chamberlain, the prison house, the place where Joseph was held. And the high chamberlain assigned Joseph to them, and he ministered to them, and they stayed a good while under guard.
Yeah. Great. So the high chamberlain or the captain of the guard, so you have said Hattabachim, that's the same phrase that's used for Potiphar right at the beginning of the previous chapter. So it's not actually clear whether it was Potiphar who's intended here.
If it's Potiphar, then it's Potiphar's dungeon that they're in.
Well, he's sort of the head of it's not his dungeon because it says where the king's prisoners were kept. So it's definitely some sort of official place. But Potiphar, it seems at one time or another held one of his roles seems to have been to be at the head of that place or to be in charge of the administration or the prisoners there. So is it still him or is it now someone else? It's not clear. But what is interesting is you're still getting echoes of what happened to Joseph when he first came to Egypt, just to let the reader know that God is still with him, and it's kind of the same trajectory of rise that's going to happen again. The other thing is, it says if you just go back to the beginning of the first verse, the reason you might think it's not the same guy is it says sometime later, right? How is it? Akhar hadvarim ha'ele, right? So literally after these words, or sometimes later is usually what that means. So if you add up the years, at the start of the story, Joseph is 17 years old when he is with his brothers in the Genesis account. And later you'll see when he enters Pharaoh's service, he's 30 years old. So that suggests he's in prison for about 13 years or so.
Well, we don't have how long he was in the Potiphar's house, do we? From biblically speaking.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. So we don't know how long.
That would minus the years in prison.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, so 13 from kind of being sold into slavery to entering the Pharaoh's service.
And if we take the Qur'an's number of years, bid'a sinin, then, well, again, depending on whether bid'a sinin is the additional number of years or altogether, I would think additional, right? But 13 is not too far off.
I don't know. Yeah,
13 may not be too far off.
Yeah.
Maybe a decade at least or something, I don't know.
I mean, the Mufassirin, when they're talking about this, tend to say, well, Razi says the majority agree that the additional period was 7 years and he'd already been in for 5 years. So that's 12 in total. But there's a whole bunch of statements about that. You'll find every number mentioned.
Right. There's ambiguity, so there's no way to come to a clear conclusion about that. Okay. It's also interesting from the biblical scholarship point of view, if it's not clear if this new chamberlain is the same Potiphar or not, but the idea being that he's let's just assume that it's not for a moment, that he is basically being thrown from one department in the system to another, from one chamberlain to another, from the service of one to another, different house, same scenario kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
so I'm gonna. You guys okay with me reading on?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the two of them dreamed a dream, each his own dream, on a single night, each a dream with its own solution. The cupbearer and the baker to the king of Egypt, who were held in the prison house. And Joseph came to them in the morning.
Okay, so
go ahead.
Okay. So so there's several details that the verse gives, which kind of exposes why they're so worried about it, right? The fact that they both dreamed a dream in the same night. So if it was just a dream that one of them had, that's something that's dismissible. But the fact that they're both seeing this vivid dream in the same night, and when they're sharing with each other, kind of it seems that this is what suggests to them that there's some significance to this.
Right.
And the fact that it says that they who were being held in prison indicates their vulnerability. So it's not something they can just dismiss. They need to know what's going on here because their situation is precarious anyway. So it's sort of prepping you for kind of their psychological state, which is interesting. And then the other thing that's interesting is, several commentators on Genesis note that Genesis actually has a nice symmetry when it comes to dreams, in that in the Genesis account, Joseph has 2 dreams, and then the prisoners have 2 dreams, and then Pharaoh has 2 dreams. Whereas the Quran breaks that symmetry with a single dream for Joseph. So we discussed a while back why only one of those dreams, or why that particular dream is kept. But that still leaves the question of, why break the symmetry, right? And one thing that's really, really fascinating to me is that when we come to Pharaoh's dreams, he sees 2 dreams. Joseph will say to him, the fact that you've seen this dream twice means that this is going to happen very quickly. This will happen. God is telling you that this is going to happen very soon. And you can sort of infer that maybe from the double dream that the 2 prisoners are seeing, right? That maybe he realizes, or maybe we're supposed to sort of realize, thinking back, that this is going to happen very quickly. But the Quran getting rid of one of those dreams, maybe it sort of indicates that this is something that's going to take time to fulfill, if you're familiar with the Genesis narrative.
Interesting. The other thing, maybe, I don't know, what came in my head is maybe dreams of a prophet are being separated thematically from dreams that non-prophets see. And there's a distinction being made, because these are dreams of unbelievers, as opposed, be it that they're true, as opposed to dreams of a faithful believer. Right? So it has been, in a sense, singled out, pun intended. So that's possibly the case. The other thing that I thought about was really brevity in the Quran. We've been reading from 39 onwards, and really everything we've read so far is just ayah 36, isn't it? I mean, the 2 young men entered the prison. One of them said, actually, we haven't even gotten to that part here yet, but that's a lot has been skipped and condensed into like a single ayah. And we're going to continue reading, and we're still going to be really the equivalent of that single ayah. I'm remembering an article I read a long time ago by Mustansir Mir on the ayah was فَهَزَمُوهُمْ بِإِذْنِ اللَّهِ وَقَتَلَ دَاوُدُ جَالُوتَ وَأَتَاهُ اللَّهُ الْمُلْكَ وَالْحِكْمَةَ وَعَلَّمَهُ مِمَّا يَشَاءُ. That ayah about, they were able to annihilate them, and Daud was able to kill Jalut, David was able to kill Goliath, and all of that. He said in a few phrases, several chapters of the Bible have been condensed, and each phrase representing really a summary of each of the chapters of Genesis, of what happened. هَزَمُوهُمْ بِإِذْنِ اللَّهِ قَتَلَ دَاوُدُ جَالُوتَ آتَاهُ اللَّهُ الْمُلْكَ عَلَّمَهُ مِمَّا يَشَاءُ are actually entire elaborate passages of the Bible, all summarized into one phrase each. And this is part of the literary style of the Quran, its brevity in taking from long accounts of the Bible and squeezing them into very succinct phrases.
I just have a thought on that, but can I just grab my charger? Sorry to be unprofessional. Can you give me like 20 seconds?
Otherwise, I'll give you 22 seconds.
FYI, I was looking up that reference for Sachin, but maybe he can still hear us. Regarding when Al-Razi is narrating the details of the dream, he described it as Mujahid. So one of the Tabi'een.
Oh, he attributed to Mujahid. Okay.
Yeah, so Mujahid.
How close is it to the biblical? Is it literally the biblical?
Yeah, I think it's very close indeed. Yeah. It's very close indeed when I read through it.
I remember when we went through it that there was I think there was some subtle differences. I don't know if we're referring to the same dream or same portion, but there was something that Razi had quoted that sounded almost like the Bible, but wasn't exactly like the Bible. And that spawned a discussion. Maybe there are spin-offs to these accounts as they traveled through Semitic traditions or through oral traditions. And what gets passed down to the Tabi'een may not be coming from the same kinds of rabbinical sources that are preserved elsewhere or passed down elsewhere in the same way, because oral traditions have a way of mutating over time.
Yeah. I mean, I can't remember what the difference is, because looking at it now, if I read through it, maybe we'll spot it. So according to this report from Mujahid, the cupbearer said, "I've seen myself in a garden. I came across the root of an attractive vine which had 3 branches, each of which had 3 clusters of grapes. This is, of course, my translation from Arabic. I plucked them and found that the king's cup was in my hand, so I squeezed the grapes into the cup and handed it to the king, and he drank.
Wow.
And this is his Inni arani a'asiru khamra. The one responsible for his food said, I saw as if there were 3 baskets on my head containing bread and various types of food. Then birds of prey, I put in brackets, swooped down and grabbed at it. This is his saying, Inni arani ahmilu fawqa ra'si khubzan ta'kulu at-tayru min.
Are there other sources in Jewish tradition that would add details that we're not reading in Genesis that we're getting from Razi? Because Razi's talking about a little bit the garden, the pressing of the wine, and all of that. Are we going to get that here?
We're going to get there. We're going to get that from verse 9 onwards. So
I see. Okay.
And the 3 part is important because then it becomes the 3 in each case refers to 3 days. Which again,
3 baskets.
It's not actually said in the Qur'an, but then it gets said in the tafsir. There's going to be 3 days.
So just a broader question, something that I spend quite a lot of time thinking about, and this may be a digression, so we don't have to go into it in any detail. But given what you were saying about the brevity of the Qur'an style, what does that tell us about how much of the narrative was already familiar to the audience? Because the kind of popular view that we have of Jahiliyyah is that it's just it's a blank slate. They have no idea. They're aware of there's these communities of Jews living elsewhere in the Arabian Peninsula, but really have very little idea of the biblical stories, other than maybe knowing that they're descendants of Ibrahim and Islam. But one of the things that Western scholarship is really kind of honing in on and thinking about is, well, if the Quran is so elusive and so brief sometimes in the way it tells stories, does that not actually tell us that actually there was a reasonable degree of understanding already, such that the Quran could then be elusive in the way it told its story, and the audience would be able to keep up?
So I chime in on this. My thoughts on this are that the Quran has a multi-pronged approach when it communicates a message. So ayat are being given, the Quraysh are listening who have a certain religious and anthropological background. Jews are listening, in some cases Christians may be listening who have their own distinct backgrounds. And the Quran is targeting each of them simultaneously with its language. So there may very well be people with little to no background who are now going to wonder about they're not going to see it as ambiguous. They're going to see that that's all there is. And they're going to think about it and interpret it as such. And there are people with they've heard stories and they've heard some of this passed on, or even their friends that are of different faiths or Jewish or something like that. And they know some of it and it's starting to ring a bell. And then there are the experts, the religious leadership that are hearing this and are seeing an entire khulasa of entire chapters of their tafsir studies in a single statement, and they're in awe of it. So it can be that it may not have to be reduced to a single kind of demographic with a certain kind of background when it comes to the Quran style of elaborating this. That's at least my 2 cents on the Quran style, because I think we have to be aware of multiple audiences when it comes to the Quran.
I agree entirely. Yeah.
So,
I mean, I don't have much to say beyond that. I think it's something that it's an open question that I think we have to deal with in a lot more detail as well, and looking at all the case studies and so on, and just looking at it with fresh eyes. Because certain answers which may have just been straightforward and taken for granted, there's always the opportunity to revisit things as we continue to learn about different aspects. And documents are coming to light which help us see much more about what was going on in the background that may have been part of the conversation.
Even a commentary like Mujahid's that Imam Razi is attributing that early on in the Tabi'een generation of something clearly biblically relevant in that time, which is very early on in Islam, does illustrate that there is a lot of exchange, that there is cross-pollination of some kind, and there is some knowledge of previous scripture, as formal or informal maybe. And I think there is something to be said about a lot of our the early opinions in tafsir. You can find precedents of them in the Bible. and not in every case, but in several cases, I think that you may not find that it's not stated that it's taken from the Bible, but you may find very early opinions on several ayat, several places in the Quran that are directly, biblical, or you can tell maybe there was some exposure or something. Even if these are not people that are going and doing comparative biblical studies, maybe it's just part of the, what's circulated in the time.
The issue though is that because of the rapid expansion of the Muslims very early on, and the relatively high conversion, particularly amongst Arabs and Arab Christians, it becomes very difficult to see anything in tafsir and know whether that is something that sort of came into the Arab consciousness after the expansion and after the conversion, or whether that was something that was already there.
That's also a very relevant question,
But it helps us to be able to note something down about the source, because here I have little doubt that this what Mujahid is saying originates in the Bible. Now, exactly how that happened is an interesting question, but the most important thing is, okay, now we know that is the Genesis account. He's telling almost word for word. So once we know that, we can decide what to do with it accordingly, right? So either we're going to come from a point of view that says, well, the more that we explain the Quranic ayah in light of what's in the Bible, then this would be a sound way of interpreting it, right? That's one school of thought, you could say. Another school of thought might be, well, precisely the Quran has come to update, correct, and subvert the biblical account. So we shouldn't fill the gaps with the biblical material. And in a way, those are two almost like polar opposites, but there might be a more negotiated position in between where you try to take both things into account.
I mean, it's got the Musaddiq role, and it's also got the Muhaymin role, and the truth does lie in between when it comes to, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ ذِكْرٍ كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ is there, right? I know you're thinking about how it's obscenely misused.
Musaddiq and Muhaymin are just going to throw it like that, So it's coming to confirm, but also it's a guardian over the previous. That's the way it's described in Surah Al-Ma'idah and elsewhere.
By the way, I'm rather far from the screen. Can you see how long we've been going on? Getting on the camera?
32 minutes.
32? Okay, so we got a little bit of time. Okay, alhamdulillah. I'm going to keep reading, guys. And the two of them dreamed a dream, each his own, on a single night, each dream with its own solution. The cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were held in the prison house. And Joseph came to them in the morning and saw them, and look, they were frowning. And he asked Pharaoh's courtiers, who were with him under guard in his lord's house, saying, "Why are your faces downcast today?" And they said to him, "We dreamed a dream, and there is no one to solve it."
All right, so you can see there's some really interesting differences, right, already. So firstly, it's Joseph who initiates the conversation with them, and he says to them, "Why are you looking so glum?" and so on. And if the suggestion, certainly in the text, in the Genesis account, is that had you not made that kind of first contact and made that approach, this whole conversation would never have happened. Whereas in the Quran, obviously, it's they who recognize there's something in him and approach him. And the other thing is, that's one of the second thing to think about is they said there is no one to interpret them. So there's this idea, and this is sort of widely attested in the ancient Near East, that you had professional dream interpreters. They're saying there's no professional dream interpreters in prison, and that explains Joseph's next remarks. If you just maybe read a sentence on. Yeah,
and Joseph said to them, "Are not solutions from God? Pray, recount them to me."
Yeah, so he says, you don't need professional dream interpreters. You need prophecy. That's what you need to interpret dreams. And that's a really interesting thing that he says that. So he recognizes that dream interpretation is a result of prophecy and not a result of kind of cultic and superstitious practices that some temple priest might do to help you interpret a dream. And that's really interesting that he does that, because it fits really nicely in the Quran, I think, with Yaqub al-Islam's hopes and for Jacob, his hopes for Yusuf al-Islam right at the start of Surah Yusuf, right? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would teach him dream interpretation. In light of this, in other words, will teach him true prophecy.
It's also interesting that this, in a sense, is a refutation of the popular religion that Egypt is at the time is a part of Egyptian life. And he's simply saying, are not solutions from God? Pray, recount them to me. And there may be some parallel there with the Qur'an's account, because he is, from the beginning to end, finding opportunities to mention Allah Azza wa Jalla. ذَلِكَ مِمَّا عَلَّمَنِي رَبِّي. And this may be the closest equivalent to that. This is from what my master has taught me, and here solutions are from God. Tell me, recount them to me, because apparently God would have taught me. So that's implied here and stated explicitly in the Quran. And the chief cupbearer recounted his dream to Joseph and said to him, in my dream, and look, a vine was before me, and on the vine there were 3 tendrils. I do not know what those are. And as it was budding, its blossom shot up and its clusters ripened to grapes, and Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. And I took the grapes and crushed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I placed the cup in Pharaoh's palm. Whoa. That's a lot of stuff. What exactly did he see again in the Bible? Can you put this in English for me? I read it, but it was a little bit Farsi.
So he saw a vine sort of plant with 3 branches coming out of it. So branches on which these dates grow. So they're the tendrils. And he's sort of seeing those branches on which the dates grow. He's kind of seeing the dates kind of grow and ripen in front of him, kind of in fast motion. And then as soon as they've ripened, he plucks them from the branch and squeezes them into the cup that Pharaoh's holding.
There's the squeezing in the Quran. أَعْصِرُ خَمْرًا.
Into the cup and then hands it to Pharaoh. Yeah.
I mean,
it's much more graphic than I thought it would be.
It's interesting as well. I mean, in terms of the words أَعْصِرُ خَمْرًا, there's the question that's raised in the tafsirs about, like, so squeezing, you squeeze grapes, أَعْصِرُ الْعِنَبْ لِلْخَمْرِ, right? So khamr as wine is the end product. It has to be fermented.
Right.
But here,
squeeze wine, you squeeze the grape.
He seems to be squeezing the grapes into the cup. So obviously that was going to give you grape juice, not wine. So maybe the marvelous thing or the weird thing in his dream was that he's squeezing the grapes and it's coming out directly as wine. So if that's what he's seeing in the biblical account, that might account for also the Quranic wording of أَعْصِرُ خَمْرًا. It has other explanations in tafsir, which is just to say some of the dialects called grapes khamr, or it's just a majaz, the أَعْصِرُ مَا يَؤُولُ إِلَى الْخَمْرِ.
Okay, I'm going on a limb here. I have no experience with wine, alhamdulillah, but I would imagine that if you squeeze grapes, like you said, you don't get wine, you get grape juice. And there must be a process of fermentation or something that turns the grape juice into wine, right? Which is a timely process, and this is the aging of the wine and all of that. So him saying, I'm squeezing wine, right, is kind of counterintuitive almost. I didn't realize that before, because, yeah, you can call the whole thing as a process pressing wine, but really you're pressing, and according to this dream, there is that odd expedited process where he's pressing the grape and it's going straight into the cup of the Pharaoh, which means that he's not getting, but he was expecting wine, you would imagine. He wouldn't expect grape juice, right? So he's literally pressing wine. And that might explain the odd language of the Quran, that it is odd that he's pressing, but wine is coming out. That's really interesting.
Could be.
So I placed the cup in Pharaoh's palm, and Joseph said, this is its solution. The 3 tendrils are 3 days. 3 days, hence Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, as you used to do when you were his cupbearer.
Yeah, so just the phrase, Pharaoh will lift your head, it's interesting because he will use the same phrase for the other guy. Pharaoh will lift up your head with a very different meaning. But there is something from a literary perspective interesting happening there, right? So Yisha Pharaoh et Roshecha. So Pharaoh will lift up your head, and it seems to tie in with what was said earlier, that these 2 guys, there's similarities and differences between them. So they They're both kind of stewards of Pharaoh. They both enter the prison together. They both have a dream on the same night, and yet there are differences because the dreams are different.
Right.
And so Joseph's kind of interesting way of explaining that reflects similarity and difference. He's using the same words, but with different meanings, which reflects their situation. There's a lot of similarity, but then there's this important difference as well.
Right. 3 days hence, Pharaoh. So this lifting the head, is that like a figure of speech?
Yes. Honor you. He'll
pay attention to you. He'll consider your case. Is that what this is saying?
No, he'll honor you. He'll restore you to your position.
Oh, he'll honor you.
Yeah.
Then it's being used almost in an oxymoronic sense for the next one. Lift your head and take your head.
And the next one is more literal because he says he will lift your head. Let's see. It says he will lift your head from your body or something. So he uses it more literally.
So this brings about an important observation about the contrast between the Qur'an and the Bible and the way that this exchange takes place. Yusuf alayhi salam is depicted in the Qur'an as going out of his way to, first of all, comfort them and console them that he will be helping them out and he'll be doing that for them quickly. But before he does, there's something more important that he'd rather talk to them about first. As pressing as this matter is, there's something even more pressing, it seems. And he gets to it by giving them this message about Allah and talking to them about God and all, and there's several ayat dedicated to that until we get to ayah number 41. So the conversation that began with 36 with their question is going to actually be responded to in 41. And there are all the ayat in between, which is him talking about Allah, none of which is here. Here, they come to him. He did make a brief reference to God in the beginning, are not solutions for God. ذَلِكَ مِمَّا عَلَّمَنِي رَبِّي, perhaps, which is similar to what's happening in 37. But then there is no mention of him passing on Allah's, lordship or mastery over them, to them, or preaching to them a message as a prophet or anything like that. That's completely absent here.
Yeah, and exactly, and I think part of that is the role of the function of the story in the Genesis account is very different from the function of the story in the Quran. So therefore, the function of Yusuf is very different. In the Genesis account, there's this real emphasis on how even this story is connected back to the Holy Land, right? So right before Joseph is even born, Abraham has this kind of prophecy that your descendants will be slaves for 400 years. And then now they're in Egypt. Jacob will insist on his deathbed, as we'll read later on, when I die, take my bones back to Canaan. Joseph will insist on the same thing. When I die, take my bones back to Canaan. So the whole story is again, it's, the Egyptians are kind of in the background. It's really about the Israelites, their temporary sojourn in Egypt before they kind of head back to the Holy Land. In the Quran, Yusuf Islam is now a Rasul. He's now preaching a message, whether it's to the Egyptians who are there or to his brothers who are going to come later.
Yeah. Wow. So, Habe, any thoughts before I keep reading? Okay. But if you remember, I was with you once it goes well for you to do me the kindness, pray, to mention me to Pharaoh and bring me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen from the land of the Hebrews. Wow.
So just like, get me out of this house. That phrase is going to echo with Moses. God will say, remember, I took you out of that house, meaning out of Egypt. So you see with Joseph kind of getting out of this house, he doesn't even use the word prison there, he uses the word house. It is foreshadowing, like the whole story is really about the Israelites and their kind of journey.
Interesting. The only parallel to the Quran is رَبِّ ابْنِ لِي عِنْدَكَ بَيْتًا فِي الْجَنَّةِ. Right?
Yeah.
He wants to get out of that house. But she says, instead of saying that, she says, just give me a home in Jannah and rescue me from the Pharaoh. Your face is saying something.
Did you talk about the fact that one of the dreams are separated here? So one mentions it and then he heard a positive interpretation than the other one asked. Whereas in the Quran, it appears that they're asking together and they're getting the answer together.
Yeah, so
Right.
we haven't mentioned that yet, but that's exactly right. So in the biblical account, that's actually in keeping with what we've seen earlier, that they didn't even initiate the conversation with Joseph, right? He initiates the conversation with them. So then one of them tells him, and then the other one says, well, actually, that's a good interpretation. I may as well tell him as well. Whereas in the Quran, because they see him as from the Muslims straight away, they both
share their
offload.
dream.
Yeah.
Very interesting difference. Okay, so now when he's, this is the Quran's equivalent of this, which is not an equivalent. Udhkurni 'inda rabbik. That's all there is. So there's not a long plea. There's not a big story. It's just Udhkurni 'inda rabbik. And here you have, but if you remember, I was with you once. It goes well for you. Do me the kindness. Pray to mention me to Pharaoh and bring me out of this house, for indeed I was stolen from the land of the Hebrews, and hereto I have done nothing that I should have been put in the pit. And so this is, again, I think a significant difference, because the Quran seems to make it clear that Yusuf alayhi salam's primary emphasis to them in the exchange that is recorded is him talking about Allah. And it's almost a passing note at the end of it that is Udhkurni 'inda rabbik. There's not a profound emphasis placed on my case, but rather the case for God, right?
Yes,
in the Quran's account. And here you have him interpreting the dream rather quickly, and then actually quite emphatically talking about his case and how he's been done wrong, and plea my case and all of it. And also the Quran's account is not even to make my case. It's just, you could look at it as Udhkurni, just make mention of me around your master, 'inda rabbik, not even li rabbik, right? In the proximity of the king, just kind of bring up my name. Maybe somebody else might hear it. Maybe somebody else might say, hey, yeah, whatever happened to him? Where is he at? Wait, he's in prison? What? What's he doing there?
Yeah.
And, it might stir up a conversation. But here you have a very direct, go to the king and plead to him and let him know that I was done wrong and I didn't deserve to be here.
Yeah.
All of which is absent in the Quran.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. And what's really interesting is the language here. They show me kindness, chesed. That's like a really important theological word in across the biblical corpus. It's usually reserved for God showing kindness. So here he's saying, let Pharaoh show me chesed and let him get me out of this house, recording how God will one day get the Egyptians out of this house. So he's really, the language of the biblical account here is really putting Pharaoh at a very high pedestal. Let him show me chesed, let him get me out of this house. Whereas all of that is sort of missing from the Quran, and sort of what occurs to you at the back of your mind is, yes, mention me to your Lord, but he sort of knows that ultimately Pharaoh is beyond his power to show him real kindness.
I'm going to say something psychedelic and maybe politically incorrect. So, hey, you think that's what popularized that tafsir?
I mean, the
could it have had a hand?
The thought comes into my mind that at least, okay, the understanding that Yusuf may have forgotten to mention his Rabb doesn't come across very much from the way it's worded in the Quran. Like in terms of Udhkurni 'inda rabbika doesn't imply anything about that he forgot. But if you read this account, you would sort of see he's mentioning a lot about other people's kindness and he's not mentioning Allah's kindness. So what connection between those two things, I'm not certain, but you can see how this could reinforce that way of reading the ayah. Yeah,
that's interesting. And then the final thing, he says, I was supposed to be carried off from the Hebrew. I've done nothing to deserve being put in dungeon here. That's a really interesting contrast with if it is Yusuf Islam, the Quran related says, وَمَا أُبَرِّئُ نَفْسِي إِنَّ النَّفْسَ لَأَمَّارَةٌ بِالسُّوءِ. If that is Yusuf Islam speaking. But generally what you see in the Quran, لَوْ يُؤَاخِذُكُمُ اللَّهُ مَا تَرَكَ عَلَىٰ ظَهْرِهَا مِن دَابَّةٍ. This idea that I've done nothing wrong, I don't deserve to be here. That's completely absent from the Quranic Yusuf, who would never say, I don't deserve this.
Right.
And he seems to say the opposite of that. He says,
he turned to Allah and said, I'll take it. If that's what it means to hold on to my chastity, then I'll take it.
Right.
Right. So it would be counterintuitive for him to say, I don't deserve to be here. Subhanallah. Alayhi salam. Alayhi salam. What an incredible contrast. So, and the chief baker saw that he had solved well, and he said to Joseph, I too in my dream, and look, there were 3 open work baskets on my head, and in the topmost were all sorts of food for Pharaoh, baker's ware, and birds were eating from the basket over my head. And Joseph answered and said, now this seems like Razi, right, Sahib?
Yeah, the details of it is the same as it was narrated from Mujahid, yeah.
Mujahid, yeah. Okay. And Joseph answered and said, this is its solution. The 3 baskets are 3 days. 3 days, hence Pharaoh will lift up your head, this time literally, right?
Right.
From upon you. Yeah, so there's the part where he's going to sever the head.
Yeah.
Almost. And impale you on a pole, and the birds will eat your flesh from upon you. Holy Allah.
So there is an interesting difference here, which is that the Quran is often understood to, I actually want you to speak to you guys about this. So I think the Quran mentions crucifixion here, right?
Yeah.
But the biblical tala is to hang. And as I understand it, I meant to look into this, but I didn't get an opportunity to. Tasleeb in Arabic doesn't have to mean crucifixion in the kind of Jesus sense that we're familiar with. It can just mean to hang someone on a pole and let them die, right? So is that correct?
As far as I understand, yeah, the arms don't have to be necessarily spread out and across, but it's
the Pharaoh says, right?
في جذوع النخل, yeah. So yeah. It is attaching to a stake or to a trunk or whatever it may be. Yeah. That's the pivotal part.
So it can be kind of a hanging too, or staking.
But I don't think you get the suggestion here that his head will be removed from him, because you don't get that from here. فَيُصْلَبُ فَتَأْكُلُ الطَّيْرُ مِنْ رَأْسِهِ. That's what we have.
Yeah, so I'm not sure the biblical account is necessarily literally a decapitation. It will be lifted from.
I was thinking of that too.
You'll be lifted up and just hung on this structure.
Ouch. Yeah. And it happened on the 3rd day. And by the way, the 3rd day meaning it's pretty expedited, right? And we were talking, Sahib, you and I, about how ظَنَّ لِلَّذِي هُوَ نَاجٍ وَقَالَ لِلَّذِي ظَنَّ هُوَ نَاجٍ, that the ism fa'il najim would be an expedited something that's going to happen around the corner, and it's for sure to happen.
Wow.
As opposed to Yanju.
He was about to be safe. Yeah, he was about to escape.
That's really nice. So again, it adds emphasis to this kind of the slow fulfillment of Joseph's dream versus the rapid fulfillment of the other dreams, right?
Yeah. But the other thing I didn't mention from a verbiage point of view is inni arani for both of them, and the mudari' seems to suggest maybe recurring dreams, even possibly, and that they didn't just see it; they continue to see it. Whereas they saw it on the same night, and that's enough for them to come in or to be bothered by it. But it seems the Quran is saying that they keep seeing it, and they discussed it with each other, and then they both decided together to come to Yusuf and say, hey, we keep having this problem. This is what made it weird. Not that we saw it on the same night, but the fact that we both keep seeing the same dreams with each other, and now we need a diagnosis, and you seem like our best bet.
What does Pharaoh say later on? Does he also, or the king rather, does he also say that on? But whereas Yusuf says Ra'aytu. That's interesting.
Right. And
the prophet needs one dream, and the others, right?
Well, no, but Ibrahim alayhi salam, inni ara fil manami, right? And he did see recurring dreams of the sacrifice, arguably. So you've got Samir Rai talked about the mudari and madi in the dreams, that the ara may be suggesting that they saw it more than once, and the ra'aytu that they saw it huduth, they saw it once, and so ra'aytu 11 kawkaban. So that is, I think, an important difference to at least highlight here. Okay, guys, let's call it a day for here, and we will pick up from where we leave off and look at the basket guy's case. The basket case. But yeah, then we'll look at, or maybe we're almost at the end of this, aren't we? Is there more to the prison in the Bible?
No, it's just it's just 3 more verses, really, 3 or 4 more verses.
Let's just do it. Let's go for it. Okay. And it happened on the third day, Pharaoh's birthday. Wow. That he made a feast for all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker in the midst of his servants, and he restored the chief cupbearer to his cupbearing, and he put the cup in Pharaoh's hand, and the chief baker he impaled, just as Joseph had said, solved it just as Joseph had solved it for them. But the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. No, he forgot him. فَأَنْسَاهُ الشَّيْطَانُ ذِكْرَ رَبِّهِ is so heavy, and here it's just he just forgot him.
Yeah, I mean, even watching the impaling of his old friend, didn't remind him of the
too distracted by the birthday, which according to the Qur'an, is أَنْسَاهُ الشَّيْطَانُ ذِكْرَ رَبِّهِ, the party.
or the wine.
The wine, yeah. لَيْسَ مِنْ عَمَلِ الشَّيْطَانِ.
I get in trouble when I suggest these things, but that's the thing. Like, it's something which has always, what do you call it? I'm trying to avoid any puns here if I can. Something has flowed through all the stories of evil in history, no doubt, right? So it's not, and to literally think about someone whose job is wine, he's a sommelier or whatever, right? So he might enjoy some of these finer things that he gets access to. So maybe that's an aspect of the shaitan, because it's just allusion or suggestion. You can't really be certain.
Let me ask you something. The famous debate between Abraham and Nimrod, and قال ربي الذي يحيي ويميت قال أنا أحيي وأميت. Right? That I give life and death. Is it the biblical account that he freed one slave and executed the other?
No.
Arbitrarily to make the point. That's mentioned in tafsirs, right? That he that the Namrud brings out one, marked for death and sets him free, and one that was supposed to be set free and executes him, and something along those lines. I don't know, just rang a bell when I read this. It seems from the biblical reading, it's rather arbitrary. It's his birthday, he's in a good mood, and he just kind of decides that one guy is just going to die and one guy is going to live. It doesn't seem like a justice system thing or a deserving thing, because the scene that's set for this is actually almost taking away from this being an actual court hearing or a trial or anything like that. It is the king decides, you know what? I don't like his. I didn't like his.
I think that's exactly right. No. Yeah, and even at the start of the story, when they enter prison, the verb for Pharaoh became angry with him is qataf, which is to lose your mind, just blow up in rage, which is not the ordinarily used verb khara to get angry, but qataf is to lose your temper impetuously. So the picture that's sort of painted then of this Pharaoh, of this impetuous, all-powerful guy, just deciding who he's going to get rid of, who he's going to throw away on a whim. And so you see that at the start of the story. That's really interesting. You see that at the end here as well. He just on a whim decided to throw them in prison, on a whim decided to let one live and let the other die. Which sets up a nice kind of tension about what's going to happen with him.
I was thinking about this because, and I want to hear from you, Saib, too. I was thinking about this because the Qur'an's picture of this particular king seems to be more sensible. He doesn't seem like an impulsive, erratic type king. He seems like, listen, this guy's analysis is pretty sensible. No, you didn't come up with this analysis. Find me the guy who did. He saw through the cupbearer's lie about, the interpretation later on, and wants to see Yusuf for himself. So there is a contrasting picture. I don't know what the later depiction of the same king is in the Bible, but already it seems, if he's this arbitrary, why would there even be a point in bringing you up to be spared? Kind of, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I don't know. What were you going to say, Sohaib?
I was going to say that I think at the beginning we didn't really draw attention to the fact that also in tafsir we have a bit more of a story here about why they were in prison than is actually mentioned here in the Bible. So again, they may have drawn that from other sources, but
that's an interesting question to raise. Let's talk about that.
The riwayah that talks about this whole thing of like they were involved in an assassination plot. One of them was actually involved, and the other one was sort of dragged in. So yeah,
so they were told to poison the food and the drink, and the cupbearer didn't go through with it. Remember?
Yeah. So then, so it's like there's more detail, and obviously one can't really have a isnad that goes back to pharaonic times and pre-pharaonic times to know the reality of that, but it's ideas that were circulating again to sort of fill in the gaps, and it'd be interesting to see whether those were also in extra biblical sources, because that's an example of something that's not here in Genesis.
Yeah,
that particular set of detail. And we had an idea, didn't we, Ustad Nouman, about also the fatayan, and the fact that Yusuf is described as fata just before that, turawidu fataha an nafsi.
Yeah.
And I think some of the tafsirs even hint towards this, that maybe these other young men were thrown into prison just as a sort of smokescreen, to cover up what had happened with Yusuf being unjustly imprisoned. So it was like he was just sort of thrown in at the same time as several others who were said to be in a plot, maybe to overthrow the king or to assassinate him, just so that Yusuf looked like he was one of that party, so people would not question why is this one person being placed in prison. I'm sure we didn't entirely make that up. We got some hints of that from somewhere and then maybe elaborated slightly.
Yeah. I wasn't entirely sold on that depiction, but it's not completely out of the question either that two other young men are going in.
And the Qur'an is very particular about this detail that they're entering with him, and the description of Fatayan
right,
as
and
well.
The rationale for his imprisonment is just not mentioned, at least the public rationale. The secret rationale, badalahum min ba'di ma ra'aw al-ayat, is mentioned.
Yeah.
But the public rationale, and the Bible actually mentions a very public rationale. The husband is infuriated, gets him thrown in jail. Right? It's actually not that the case. That's not the case at all in the Quran. It's going in the opposite direction. The husband's telling him, calm down, overlook this, let's not talk about it again. A'rid an hadha. Right? So he's actually going in the opposite direction. And then later on, it seems like a politically savvy move to take him out of the spotlight, because now multiple elite women are involved in this entire debacle. So it's going to be too embarrassing for the entire administration, maybe even going up to the king and the people around him. So best to just make this kid disappear. You know.
And in a way, like when you're talking about this sort of Nimrud comparison, and uhyi wa umit.
Right.
So maybe Pharaoh in this case, he's left one of them. He's caused one of them to live in that way, caused one of them to die, and left one of them, between life and death. We just left them in prison. Yeah. So he was brought out. Why were those two brought out at that point? One of them was brought out and exonerated completely. One of them was brought out and executed. And the third one, if we see them as a trio in a way
probably at this point in the story, Pharaoh isn't aware of his existence. I mean, he's just a number, one in among several prisoners. Those two were the heads of at the Bayyinah.
Yeah, I know, but it sort of depends which scripture we're reading and with which lens, because so in the Quranic account they're just called Fatayan. They're not the head anything, so they're not given grandeur. Yusuf Alayhi also maybe was nobody, but there was a scandal that had started to emerge in the Aziz's palace, and it might have been serious enough that even word got to the king that your guy that you appointed last year, and you need to reshuffle your cabinet, because there's a British expression now, so I won't get it. You need to reshuffle your cabinet.
I get it. Okay.
And you come from a country where there's nepotism.
I wasn't thinking about reshuffle your cabinet as in reorganize the books on your shelf. Okay.
Yeah. That's exactly it. So the point is that there might have been the king might have been somewhat aware of it, but that might have also made it harder for the cupbearer to mention something about it until eventually he forgot.
There's an interesting contrast here. Okay, so I think we've reached the end. Yes, the birthday.
Yes.
The last thing I'll say is, can you tell me something about the Hebrew of "No, he forgot him"? Can you tell me that?
Yeah. So the verse shachach is just to forget. It's nasiya. The translation is just nasiya. It doesn't imply that he. I mean, the implication is that he just forgot him. Not that he deliberately didn't mention
I know
him,
you haven't heard me on this, but the last lecture I did on Surah Yusuf was just on فَأَنْسَاهُ الشَّيْطَانُ ذِكْرَ رَبِّهِ.
Okay.
We spent several hours on فَأَنْسَاهُ الشَّيْطَانُ ذِكْرَ رَبِّهِ. Several days on just deciphering فَأَنْسَاهُ الشَّيْطَانُ ذِكْرَ رَبِّهِ, because it's that heavy in the Qur'an and that heavy in tafsir literature. And yet here it's just a passing, we just kind of gloss over it. He forgot him. Right? And there's so much to learn from that one phrase. So I was just kind of struck, maybe it's such a big deal in the Bible and then it's a big deal in the Quran. It's not the case. The Quran is definitely highlighting things in the story that were non-essential, or they were just kind of things that move the story along but don't have, philosophical or spiritual or, theological implications. They're simply just parts of the story that make the story move forward. It's a really interesting contrast, what the Quran decided to highlight and what the Quran didn't decide to highlight. And it seems to be in many cases very contradictory in that, and from a style point of view, not content, but even from a style point of view, from the biblical telling of the story. It is a very different telling.
Yeah, so what's interesting here is, in the book, it begins, وَلَوْ زَخَارْ سَرْحَ هَمَّشْقِيم. So the head of the kind of cupbearers did not mention, right, at Yosef. He didn't mention Joseph, and he forgot him. So you could just read that as just a final comment, rather he forgot him. Or you could see it as he didn't mention him. Like initially, it was just a conscious decision not to mention him for whatever reason, and then over time, he just forgot him. But what is interesting in the Quran is just straight from Ansahu Shaitan Dhikra Rabbi. The Nisyan and the Dhikr kind of go much more hand in hand, maybe. Maybe attributing the whole thing to Shaitan rather than an initial kind of decision on his part. Remember, possible.
Like in Arabic, dhikr could either be to remember or to mention, right?
Yeah, right.
Because I'm looking at a translation here, which is the cupbearer did not remember Joseph; he forgot him.
Yeah, it could be either. Yeah,
mention. So the same, or is it a cognate?
Yes, a cognate with the same duality, mention or remember.
Wow, so the same thing with Arabic, the dhikr, and it was mentioned and remembering.
Yeah,
cool.
Yeah. This is why everyone should learn Hebrew so easily.
Yeah, forgetting the dhikr seems to make it mention, but forgot to mention. Yeah.
All right, guys. We'll stop it at that, and inshallah, Sahib, you and I will continue our discussion, inshallah, for tomorrow, and we'll pick up on 43, and we'll get back to you, Saqib, and have this session again when we reach the redemption from prison. That's what we'll get up to in Yusuf, in the story, and then we'll come back to you, inshallah ta'ala.
Including the women episode?
I think that's up for debate. I don't know how far along that'll be.
Okay.
Because that might be quite a bit, actually. So I want to do it in digestible chunks, kind of like, I think we did quite a bit, and the earlier episodes were rather loaded. So I want to take them little at a time, compare, and then little at a time, and maybe see you more frequently, but for lesser chunks, inshallah.
Happy
Thank you both once again for a very insightful session. Really enjoying this stuff. I pray Allah Azza wa Jalla accepts, and I pray all of you benefit. Jazakumullahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.